My name is Jana Remy, and I'm the Director of Educational Technology for Chapman University, and I also teach here. And one of the classes that I teach is the History of Disability in America. So you asked about the 504 sit-ins, which is an incident in history that's really not particularly well known. But yet the term 504 is known to most teachers because of 504 plans that are created for students with accommodations. So I'll talk about the history of the 504 sit-in, like what happened. So the 504 sit-in started on April 5th, 1977. And what occurred was there were several events that led up to it that I'll explain. It occurred because in 1973, there was a Rehabilitation Act that had a section, a provision called 504, and although I can't quote the words verbatim, it essentially said that any program or entity that was receiving federal funds couldn't discriminate against someone because of reasons of handicap, which was the language they used then, but now we would say disability. And when that 1973 Act was passed, there was no explanation or provision of how that was to be implemented. Who qualified for having a disabling condition or being disabled wasn't described. What the timeline was for providing accommodations wasn't described. There was also no sense of who exactly needed to make those accommodations, what entities needed to make those accommodations. So disability activists felt very strongly that they needed to know this because the only way for them to try and express their rights under that 504 legislation or under that 1973 Rehabilitation Act was to go to federal court, and that was unacceptable. And time-consuming, and certainly not most people didn't have the capacity to do that. So they said, we need a timeline, and we need to know who's disabled, who can receive this benefit, and what are the consequences for federal institutions that aren't complying. And so the activists that were agitating for follow-up legislation planned a series of sit-ins. And they decided on April 5th that they would go in 10 different cities to the Hugh Administration Building, the federal building, and they would insist that that there be follow-up legislation. And on that date in San Francisco, they not only went to insist that there be this legislation, but they stayed. They didn't leave. And in the other cities where these demonstrations or the activists went to the Hugh offices, and I should actually back up and explain, Hugh is Housing, Education, and Welfare Offices. There's an acronym, HEW, for Hugh. So in the other cities besides San Francisco, they left after a matter of hours. But in San Francisco, they stayed. And the activists themselves that went to the Hugh office in San Francisco didn't even go with the intention or knowledge that they would just keep staying. They went trying to demand and assert the need for the legislation, and then realized they just had to stay. And they were, in some ways, I think, responding to patterns of other people who had been agitating for civil rights prior to that. And so they stayed there for 24 days. They occupied the building. And just to kind of set the circumstance, there's some very powerful photographs of this event that you can find looking online if you were to Google 504 sit-in. But many of these people were wheelchair users or had disabilities that were physical disabilities that would have been challenging for them to actually engage in a sit-in. And by occupying the building, they were cut off from the assistance that they needed to be able to perform daily life activities. They were in a building that was not accessible, so those that couldn't navigate stairs were having to either have their wheelchairs lifted up the stairs or crawling up and down staircases, and they were cut off from food. And even the phones were cut off in the building. They didn't have the ability to communicate out. Of course, this is before the internet and before everyone walks around with a phone in their pocket. So it was such a bold act for them to stay in the building and say they weren't leaving. It put many of the protesters health at risk, but they recognized that they were willing to do that because they felt that it was so important that this legislation be passed, that they were willing to put all their personal comfort and even their own health and safety at risk for this. And other groups that helped, there were other allies and other organizations that helped the protesters, brought in food, brought in mattresses, brought in medical supplies to help them to be able to stay in the building. And of course what happened is the media got wind of this occupation, and that helped bring the story across the country. There's some fantastic footage from CBS that's available on YouTube that you can watch as the stories unfolding of the people that were, insisted they weren't going to leave the building.
No otherwise qualified handicapped individual in the United States shall, solely on the basis of his handicap, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. On April 5, 1977, people with disabilities across the nation demonstrated to demand that regulations implementing Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act be signed into law. The demonstrations spontaneously erupted into sit-ins. In San Francisco, over 100 people made the federal building our home for 26 days.
And there's some fantastic stories, oral history stories that have been collected, books that have been written about those who participated in that 504 sit-in. So I think going back to the original question, what's so important about this is when a teacher in a K-12 classroom recognizes that they need to do the paperwork or create an accommodation for a student as part of a 504 plan, they aren't aware of the history behind it. That 504 plans were created because of so many individuals with disabilities that had been marginalized historically, that had been cut off from access to education, that had been cut off from access to public spaces, because in that time period there weren't even curb cuts, right, to be able to navigate a city. A curb cut is a little ramp on the corner that allows you to get onto the sidewalk. So you can imagine the challenges for someone who had mobility issues to even occupy public space when that wasn't accessible, not to mention, of course, stairs, creating barriers in lots of different types of buildings. But, really what's most important, I think, is that every individual had the right and access to education in the United States. School children could not be discriminated against or not have barriers to learning because of reasons of disability. That's why 504 plans are so important. And that's why I think it's critically important also for instructors and for teachers, in K-12 education to understand a little bit of the history and the stories of those people who decided it was worth risking their own health to assert this right to have access to education, access to resources. So you asked me about individuals that may have participated or organizations that were involved in the 504 sit-in that might be important for teachers to become familiar with their names, to share with their students. And one thing I think I've learned from teaching disability history is I'm a little bit wary of the kind of history or telling the story of history where you might have a history textbook that's telling something about the civil rights era, and then you have a little call out in the corner that's Helen Keller or some remarkable person, but they're not really part of the story, right? They're like almost pasted on top of it, right? Something that's separate. And so sometimes I feel a little bit wary of saying there's this important person that participated, because then it doesn't show that it was kind of a group of common people, right, who weren't necessarily figureheads or someone who's separate and special and important. Within the disability community, there's a lot of people who feel that when people with disabilities are put on pedestals as being special or different, it doesn't show that in the United States or throughout the world, 1 in 5 people have disabilities, right? This is your neighbor and your friend and your sibling and yourself, right? This is not somebody who's so different from you. So sometimes I feel a little wary to say, here's this special, amazing person who did something remarkable because of that history of portrayals of people with disabilities as being unusual or remarkable. But at the same time, there certainly were individuals that were involved. One of the people whose names I think every school child in California should know is Ed Roberts. So he was someone who he was. Let me think. There's so many facets to his story. Condense it. He was involved in the 504 sit-ins and the activism that led up to those, but he's perhaps most well known because he was the first student that UC Berkeley admitted with significant disabilities. And at the time, when they admitted him, they didn't realize that he was a polio survivor, and he would need to sleep at night in an iron lung device, which is quite a bulky piece of equipment. In order to be safe and healthy, he would need that. And there was, at that time, which was in the 70s, there was no mandate or provision that a school had to be accommodating to a student that had a need like that, a medical need or a need related to their disability. And so once UC Berkeley recognized that he had this need, they said, sorry, we can't really help you. We're not set up to help a student that has that kind of need. He pushed, and they finally were able to find a space for him in an infirmary building. So they let him, instead of having a dorm room, he slept in the nurses' infirmary or at UC Berkeley. And what ended up happening as a result is more students with disabilities applied to UC Berkeley, and they ended up also being housed in this infirmary wing, and they formed a group called the Rolling Quads that was asserting their rights to be on campus and to receive higher education. And so I think Ed Roberts' name comes out quite a bit when people talk about this history, because they recognize that his group they were forceful in asking for their rights. They didn't give up when they were discouraged. And they also had a sense of sort of playfulness and humor about themselves. And they formed an identity, kind of a collective identity that even though their disabilities were different, they recognized that they were kind of asking for similar things and for the right to be on a campus of higher education. So I would name him certainly as someone who was involved with the 504 sit-ins, who I think everyone should know. There are several other individuals that Kitty Cohn is one of them, Judith Hoyman is one of them, Holland DeLille is another, and all of these individuals have their stories in the oral history repository at the Bancroft Library. They've been interviewed and their stories have been documented. Holland DeLille has also written a book about her experience with extensive photographs. Many of the photographs we have of the 504 sit-in are from her. And that book is called Becoming Real in 24 Days. And it's the story of how she evolved and how she felt about that moment when she decided, I'm not going to leave. And the kind of community that was created as a result of people helping each other and to endure that sit-in experience. So I'm going to talk about the historical context for the 504 sit-ins, and I think it's important to realize this didn't just happen in a vacuum. People just didn't decide to sit in a building. Prior to that, people with disabilities oftentimes weren't mainstreamed like they are now, right? This term kind of refers to the fact that you might have students with disabilities in your classroom, in your community, in your workplace. But especially those that had visible disabilities, they were typically institutionalized, or had sensory disabilities, were typically institutionalized. And they were housed full-time in that institution, and they were educated in that institution. So they weren't living with their families, they weren't participating in the neighborhood community, and they weren't going to normal public schools or mainstream public schools. So as a result of that, there was a moment of backlash. And again, it kind of centered around the civil rights era, when people with disabilities who had been institutionalized were recognizing that what they'd been given was a separate experience. They weren't mingling in public society. They were somewhere else, separate. And they, as a group, began to assert their right to be part of society. And primarily where we saw that happen was in a movement called the independent living movement. And that was a reaction against institutions where people had lived and had received their education, to say people with disabilities can actually live independently and on their own, or they can live in co-housing, or I don't even want to use the word institution, but live in an organization where they're supporting each other as part of that organization. It's run by people with disabilities. People with disabilities are making decisions, and they're supporting each other, instead of it being something that where the medical establishment or some other group is making decisions for treatment, making decisions for access. So the independent living movement, again, Ed Roberts was a lead figure in that movement. That really coalesced in the late 60s, early 70s, and the first Center for Independent Living was in San Francisco, and Ed Roberts was key in forming that center in 1972. And then independent living centers spread across the United States. We certainly have many independent living centers in California. So that motivation from people with disabilities to say, we want to engage in society, we don't want to be separate, helped to lead to the 504 sit-in. That was one of the events on the path there. And when you see the names of the people who were involved in the independent living movement, they're very similar to the names. There's a big overlap between those that were involved in the 504 sit-in. Now, of course, then it's important to think, well, what happened as a result of the 504 sit-in? And, we can almost imagine some of these things as stepping stones that led to the ADA. So the passage of the ADA ensured that people with disabilities had full access to public life and civic life in the United States, that it became illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities. And it wasn't illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities prior to that. So that was huge. And the impact of that is something that, all of us in American society feel today. That's why there's ramps, in addition to stairs, and there's elevators in buildings with more than one floor where, I just lost my train of thought. There's all kinds of ways in which our society has incorporated access and removed barriers as a result of the ADA. We expect, if we have disabilities and we're in the workplace, that we'll receive the accommodations that we need so we can do successful work. That wasn't a right that was given to us prior to the ADA. Well, I think it's important to recognize that the 504 sit-ins didn't just happen and then nothing happened after that, right? They had cause and effect, and as a result of the 504 sit-in, there was legislation that created a pathway for the rights to be implemented. There was also legislation that defined what a disability was, so that people knew who did and who did not qualify for having an accommodation as a result of the 504 legislation. I think it's also important to recognize that this was one step on the way to the American with Disabilities Act, which passed in 1990, and that was the most landmark legislation because it, under federal law, said it was unacceptable and illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities. And prior to that, it was legal to discriminate. You could opt not in a restaurant to serve people with disabilities. People with disabilities were not mainstreamed into the classroom, and there were certainly all types of social barriers that existed for people with disabilities, whether it was a staircase, which is the example we often think of, or whether it was libraries that didn't have books in Braille, or whether it was restaurants that were serving food without listing the ingredients for people who had allergies or who were diabetic. So there's so many things that we take for granted that we actually don't recognize were the result of the ADA mandating that people with disabilities be able to live, be able to patronize restaurants, be able to go to school, be able to have fulfilling work, and when that didn't exist beforehand. So you asked me to talk about the types of, I don't even know how to describe it. I want to say ailments or physical differences that might fall under the umbrella of disability, and how that wasn't defined prior to the 504 sit-ins, and that legislation has been adopted over time to help define who qualifies for an accommodation under the ADA. So, and the spectrum is wide, and it's so wide I couldn't name them all, but I can talk about a little bit about where the edges of that spectrum might be, where people would qualify. It might be, of course, the example we think of is a wheelchair user, but it might also be someone with a food allergy. It might be someone with a chronic health condition, like an example might be asthma, right? They have a need to have medication when their asthma is triggered. If they can't, if they need that medication during school hours, then they might need an accommodation that allows them to get that medication when they need it. So the spectrum is huge, and there have been some challenges to that. For example, does someone who has an addiction to alcohol, do they qualify as part of the ADA? And there's legislation that says no, they don't qualify for an accommodation if they have an addiction to alcohol. But there's certainly other types of medicalized conditions. Some things which can be their choice, like someone who becomes pregnant and then asks for an accommodation as a result of pregnancy, that does qualify for an accommodation. And some things, if someone has an illness or an ailment because of a choice like smoking, that's become kind of more of a gray area about those accommodations, or like I mentioned, someone who has an addiction, that's kind of a gray area. So there's been further legislation to clarify who does and doesn't qualify. And but I think in general, in school settings, if school children are wondering what qualifies, and the language is written such in the legislation that if what your physical difference or your medical condition interferes with an important life activity, and that life activity might be getting up and caring for yourself, being able to feed yourself, being able to drive a car, being able to go to school, or being able to read a book, then you would qualify for an accommodation under the ADA. In the historiography of disability in America. And when I say historiography, it's how historians have studied a topic. For example, we might look at the Civil War and how it was studied 100 years ago, and then look at the Civil War now and how it's studied, and we could see some significant differences on what historians are highlighting about that event, what historians think is important about that event, and how they're describing the people that participated in the Civil War. So even though the Civil War is something that happened in the 19th century and it's in the past, how historians look at that event has changed. And so in the historiography of disability, we see changes in the approaches depending on how it oftentimes goes hand in hand with how people with disabilities were treated at different times. When there's huge absences in the historiography of disability really until the 1960s and 1970s. If people with disabilities were discussed, they were really discussed as someone who was either an extreme aberration, like as deviant or very different, or they were discussed as someone who was overcame so many obstacles to do something remarkable. And now the approach to studying people with disabilities is to look at them as individuals who were a part of the fabric of American society. They weren't exceptional or different. And the other thing that historians have been doing, and I should say that the historiography about disability is quite new in a way, because I think looking at disability culture, at disability history, at disability in society within academia is a fairly new lens to be adopting. And so a lot's being written where historians are going back and finding disability in places they hadn't seen it before. So an example of that is a fantastic article that's been written by historian Douglas Bainton. In that article, he talks about how disability is actually fundamental to the three major debates about civic rights in American history. He points out the first one being when enslaved Africans were getting the right to vote and to participate in society. When society, or when people were fighting against the abolition of slaves, they said, well, people from Africa are inherently not as smart, or they can't handle freedom. They use the language of disability to describe the bodies of those people, to say, well, people with disabilities, like enslaved people, can't participate in civic life, or don't qualify for participation in civic life. We would see the same thing in arguments about women voting and women participating in civic life around the era of suffrage, there was a sentiment that women were genetically inferior or physically inferior, couldn't handle education, and therefore they were disabled and not able to vote or not able to be further educated or to participate in civic life. And then we also had the moment in American history where we're having waves of immigration in the early 20th century, and we saw groups of people being denied entry to the US because they were either identified as having a disability or they were perceived as having a disability. And that discriminated against certain races, against people that were older because they were perceived as not being capable of working. So whole groups of people were identified as disabled and therefore not allowed to immigrate. So in each of those three moments in American history, those that were agitating for the rights of those groups said, no, they're not disabled. They're actually, they're fit to participate in civic society or in society. So what was happening was, everyone agreed that people with disabilities shouldn't vote or shouldn't participate, but these other groups defined themselves as not disabled and therefore agitated for the right to immigrate, to vote, and to be free. So when we look at it that way, we see disability as sort of fundamental to the argument for civic participation in our country. And we can see that this isn't just one marginalized group of people. This has actually been, this rhetoric around disability and who could participate is something that's been going on throughout American history. And so I think that's what's happening in the historiography of disability history, as scholars are going back and saying, no, we've been talking about disability all along. Or we might even define disability as simply different types of bodies, right, that weren't people with that category of body or that category of body or that category of physical experience aren't being allowed to participate fully. When they deviate from the norm, which throughout American history has typically been a white male body. So if it's a female body, or if it's a person of color, or if it's someone who's from a different ethnicity or someone who is disabled, they don't fit that type. The groups that helped those that were doing the 504 sit-in, I think most notable was the Black Panthers. They stepped in and brought food every day to those that were participating in the 504 sit-in. In which many of the oral histories cite as being absolutely necessary. They couldn't have done it without that support. But there were churches that were bringing in food, bringing in medical supplies. There were other organizations that brought in food. They had, because of the media coverage, which is quite remarkable, they had the sympathy and support of the American people for what they were doing. And I think that was super important to them being able to stay there for so many days because they knew they had so many people cheering them on. I also just want to add one more footnote that I think is kind of an interesting story from that. So, I mentioned that they cut off the phone lines so they couldn't communicate with anyone who was outside of the building. Well, I think what they didn't realize when they cut off the phone lines, someone who knows sign language could still communicate with the outside, because what they did is they just went upstairs to the high windows and signed out the windows to the media to share with them with what they were doing. So I think over and over again, the oral histories about this moment have such remarkable stories of how they were able to do this sit-in despite all of the apparent obstacles. They persisted, they were smart and savvy, and they supported each other, and they had this huge amount of public support also cheering them on.